Hello and welcome to the Contemplations. My name is Hugo and I'm here with Josh.
Hello.
And this is a show from the Lotus Studios where we delve into some deeper topics, not necessarily current events, and we try to bring to you something that we feel is important, interesting, and valuable. And so, following on yesterday's discussion, this is going to be a second part of talking about Marx's life and how his life shaped his beliefs. And so yesterday we ended right where Marx's father died and how that affected his life. So we're going to take off from there. And
Sure. So I'm going to start from 1841 with a satirical poem by Engels and Bauer, who were friends of Marx, ironically, although they don't exactly describe him in the best of terms. So they say, "Black fellow from Trier, a savage sinewy monster who creeps not but leaps upon his prey, who stretches his arms towards the heavens as if he would tear down their canopy, who clenches his fist and raves as if 1,000 devils had him by the hair." So, I mean, that's not the kind of description I'd want from my friends, but it seems like...
So those were the people who liked him.
Yeah. It seems to be a running theme, especially after he left university, that he was very domineering and angry. He would never consider opposing opinions. You either agree with him or you're an idiot, basically, which sounds very familiar when talking about some of the people who follow him in the modern day.
Right.
Because there's a very kind of binary view of Marx. You're either on his side or you're an enemy, and you'll see later on, even with his interactions with fellow communists, he's very treacherous to opposing views, and he treats them with the amount of hostility that you'd expect of Stalin in the Soviet Union. And he essentially goes behind the backs of people and stabs them in the back, as you will later see. But even by his family, he was known as Old Nick, and his son used to call him simply Devil, which is it's not exactly a flattering view of the guy.
Why would okay, Devil, that's a bit extreme, but why would he be called Old Nick? Was that his nickname? Or?
I think so, yeah. But supposedly his kind of wild look with the hair, the beard, kind of made him look a bit sinister, I guess. Anyway, so later on in 1841, Marx completed his thesis, which we touched on at the end of last episode, which was on the difference between the Democritan and that's the one, and Epicurean philosophy of nature, on atomism of those two people, and Marx's main aim to show that theology must yield to the superior wisdom of philosophy. So he believed that things that were previously the domain of theology were actually better explained by philosophy, which is not necessarily something I disagree with.
That's not something that he was originally in, right? That doesn't sound like something he would be the first to do work on, or
I think they've been compared before, but not in the context of
no. I mean that kind of aim to
of
compare
course, yeah.
theology and like to put that in the domain of philosophy instead.
It's not necessarily a completely novel demonstration, but in this particular example, I think it was.
Okay.
And he was supposedly particularly proud of it, and he also dedicated it to his father-in-law as well, which I thought was quite nice. It's one of the few nice gestures you'll see. So in May 1842, Marx went to a newspaper, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce.
Rheinische Zeitung.
There we go. In Cologne, which was a liberal newspaper, which kind of suggests that he was still very much in line with his German middle-class background and his upbringing and the teachings that his father passed on to him. and he hadn't necessarily deviated much politically while he was at university. However, throughout his time at this newspaper, he became editor-in-chief and increasingly published more radical articles, but this did actually result in it being more widely read. So he had a financial incentive, I think, to follow this angle more than anything else. It seems like because of the radicalism, it got a greater readership rather than the other way around.
So he'd only be there for like a year, right? Or something like that. Less than a
he
year.
wasn't there for very long. So while he was there, though, he did express an increasing interest in socialism and also developed an interest in economics as well, which he would very much continue for the rest of his life, particularly the socialism part, although behind his interest in economics was clearly lacking.
I don't think it was for lack of interest.
Well, that's true. Lack of understanding. So some of the people that actually worked for the newspaper said that the newspaper was run as a dictatorship of Marx, in that he was the unquestioning authority, and anyone who went against him was an idiot and would be sidelined. And he did also try and restrain some of the more radical elements that were writing for the newspaper, who he considered a bit of a thorn in his side, not because he necessarily disagreed with publishing them, but because of the censorship that was going on at the time. And these more radical articles focused on criticising the right-wing governments, as well as figures in the liberal and socialist movements who often Marx thought were ineffective or counterproductive to his own views.
So this is what he then was talking about later when he was saying that he needed to tread the line between like being radical, being interesting in that way, and being censored by the authorities.
I actually have a good quote here from Marx himself. Our newspaper has to be presented to the police to be sniffed at, and if the police nose smells anything un-Christian or un-Prussian, the newspaper is not allowed to appear. I mean, I can understand his difficulties with censorship. I'm not a big fan of it myself, so fair enough that he's annoyed about it. However, during this time, his mother cut off his allowance, which sounds really lame, which he was very, very angry about, and he referred to her as treacherous and such, even though he had a doctorate and he was working as an editor at a newspaper, and it seemed like he held this grudge against his mother for the rest of his life.
And he had had a good relationship with her, right?
Yeah,
before that,
up until that point. It wasn't necessarily negative, but he didn't have the same positive relationship that he had with his father. So at this time as well, Engels was also contributing to the newspaper and wrote a total of 17 articles anonymously for the publication. He didn't actually write under his real name until their partnership when they were writing books much later on. And the newspaper was closed down after there was an article strongly criticising the Russian monarchy, in which Tsar Nicholas I requested it be banned, and the Prussian government complied in 1843.
Oh, interesting. So it's like, so it was not that it was un-German, but they were also like pressured by others.
Yeah, I think Prussia at that time was more allied to the Russian monarchs as well. They were natural allies. They were mainly concerned about the French, I think. And speaking of Engels, on the 16th of November 1842, Marx meets Engels in person for the very first time, which will spark a collaboration, and Engels is instrumental in actually keeping Marx afloat and bailing him out later on in life with his fiscal incompetence. So in 1843, Marx became co-editor of another newspaper, which I'm going to ask you to pronounce.
Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher.
There's no way I'd ever be able to get that right. Which was a radical leftist Parisian newspaper, which resulted in him having to move to Paris. However, he struggled for funds and actually had to be bailed out by friends in Cologne. So it wasn't really enough to sustain himself with the lifestyle he had, and therefore he had to rely on his friends to send him money across.
Yeah, and so like it's important to point out, I think, that it wasn't for the lack of money that he couldn't get by. It was because of his like his eagerness to spend it. Like he when what we touched on yesterday at the when he was at the university, he would spend a lot of money on things that
alcohol
weren't
and
really,
food, pretty much.
Yeah.
A life of indulgence, which I can't blame him for. In his kind of first year of university, I kind of did the same thing, but he took it to a much more extreme extent where he racked up lots of debts, and he was also relying on his parents' money to pay for it all rather than funding it himself.
Exactly, and so this kind of lifestyle continued for him, or this habit continued for him, even after he stopped receiving the money from his parents because his father had died and his mother said that she wouldn't give him allowance anymore.
Yeah,
and so he would get contributions or gifts from other like family members or close friends, but he wouldn't be able to actually lead a decent life because he wasn't good with money like that, right?
Yeah, so the amount of money he had, he could have lived a pretty reasonable, comfortable existence, but the way in which he spent money, he liked to keep up appearances that were unsustainable. Like, he didn't like people thinking that he was living in poverty. He wanted to sustain the same lifestyle that he had, and therefore he was very willing to spend other people's money to do it, which seems like something that he very much implemented in his theories, in that socialism likes to spend other people's money.
No, it's not other people's money, it's your money if you steal it. Like, you steal it first and then it's all your money and then you get to do with it whatever you want.
Oh yeah, of course. What am I talking about? Anyway,
but I mean, that doesn't make that much of a difference, because when that money was yours, that had been given to him in his own personal life. Like that would have been his money at that point, but he spent it badly nonetheless. So.
Yeah, but he's still relied on charity from lots of other people, like his friends pooling money for him throughout.
No, but that's what I meant. Like when they give him the money, then it's his money, but he still spends it badly.
But
I know what you mean. I'm just being very annoying now. Sorry.
Yeah. If your friend is leeching money from you constantly, you kind of have got to question that friendship. And it seems like, particularly when he was in Paris, he came into conflict with lots of the radicals there over things like money, because he was very flippant with money, and I imagine that they were a bit more frugal, which isn't very difficult considering how easily Marx seemed to spend money.
So when we talk about how he was spending money not in the best way, let's say, well, then at some point it starts being his friend's fault that they keep giving him money, and like they know that this is what he's gonna do, right? And like Engels in particular, like how is this guy supporting him for like decades?
I don't. Well, Engels just had a really good job, as we'll get onto later.
I know, but he didn't like it. He hated it. He did that for him, like to support himself and Marx.
Yeah, I suppose he saw it as a necessary evil to work for his evil capitalist father in the position which he got through no merit of his own, and he was using that money for his own political causes to undermine his own interests, really, in his job. But anyway, pulling things back to Marx, in June 1843, Marx finally married Jenny von Westphalen, and this was after 7 years of actually being engaged.
So throughout his university stay, right?
Yeah. So they supposedly, not many of the family on either side actually ended up attending, mainly due to the taboo nature of the marriage and the fact that they'd probably alienated a large number of them through their politics.
So the taboo nature was because she was from a wealthier family or from a
so
family.
she was like a petty noble, whereas Marx was kind of middle class.
Right.
and also the difference in religious background as well.
Oh yeah, that's important as well, right?
And this is something that I find particularly interesting, that Jenny's mother left her a dowry in a chest which was full of gold coins, which was meant to last them. Well, you know what a dowry is. It's meant to kind of help them.
Set you up.
Yeah, exactly. And rather than actually using it for its intended purpose, they left the chest open, in which people who attended could help themselves to whatever money they wanted. So by the end of the evening, the dowry was already empty, and they were just left with an empty box. So they weren't helping themselves, really. Well,
Yeah.
but by definition.
Put it mildly.
So in 1844, whilst in Paris, Marx befriends the anarchists Mikhail Bakunin and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in Paris, as I said. So I'll just have a little background who these key figures are. So Mikhail Bakunin is a Russian revolutionary anarchist and socialist, and he is the founder of the school of thought known as collectivist anarchism. He would later go on to claim that the problem with Marx's beliefs were that rather than a dictatorship of the proletariat, it would be a dictatorship by a party over the proletariat, which was a pretty prophetic criticism, which he levelled at him around the time before anyone actually took Marx's ideas seriously.
Yeah. I mean, by the time, no, sorry, I was thinking that we were already a few years ahead, so that wouldn't be. Okay, I'm just gonna stop talking because I'm just confusing you.
It's all right. So Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was a French socialist, and he was the first person to declare himself an anarchist. He was also both a politician and a philosopher and an economist, and he founded the mutualist philosophy, which was a form of socialism but with free markets, which I wish more socialists would be in favour of, but alas.
I'm not an expert on that, but we can go into it some other time. It would be interesting.
It might be interesting, yeah, because I don't know anything about anarchism or the various strains of socialism beyond Marxism, really, because the Marxist strain has really taken over. And I mean, who really knows about these older, more
no, these ones are actually quite well known, but Marx is usually taken as the father of socialism or something like that, whereas he didn't come up with any of what he actually advocated for, or much of what he advocated for was just built upon what had already been in existence. That had already been a socialism. There had already been a communism as ideologies, and so it wasn't something that he would invent.
He did come up with a kind of dictatorship by the proletariat idea, I believe.
Yeah.
So he
had a couple of slogans like that.
Yeah, he kind of had his own spin, but the ideas more or less existed before he was espousing them. So in August 1844, Marx meets Engels again in Paris this time, and this is where the lifelong friendship begins, and they begin to actually work together in person. And Marx found that he agreed with Engels on a great deal of subjects, and Engels kind of brought him down into the rabbit hole of communism a bit more, because he was more radical than Marx at that point. However, paradoxically, he was better versed in economics as well. You don't often find that being the case.
I mean, you can be well versed in economics, but
not understand them.
Yeah, I mean, you can be well versed in it and know a lot more about it than someone who just hasn't looked into it at all, right?
That's true. I am
like
judging
that,
it from a pretty low standard. Like at this point, Marx hadn't really looked into economics very much.
Should have taken foundations of economics.
Yeah, I'm not going to plug that now though. So, in February 1845, under pressure from the Prussian government, Marx is expelled from Paris and moves to Brussels. and he publishes The Holy Family, which was written in collaboration with Engels the year before. And the book criticises Marx's earlier allies, the young Hegelians, who were the university group who were followers of Hegel. And they also worked together to publish the German ideology together, but no one publishes it, and it's actually only ever published after they both die. So that never really sees the light of day because no one wanted to publish it.
So what was that about? I haven't heard the name at all.
I'm not entirely sure because I haven't read it, but it seems to be just shoehorning in their ideas and trying to paint it as something like natively German, even though it was a very niche idea. That's at least my understanding from the brief extract I read.
Okay.
So in July 1847, The Poverty of Philosophy is finished, and this was written in French and is published in Paris and Brussels in response to the economic and philosophical arguments by French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and they're trying to alienate their own friends, it seems. And also in August 1847, the foundation of the German Workers' Society in Brussels is established. That doesn't make sense. It was founded. So yeah, you can see that Marx is kind of ramping up his efforts here to engage with tangible political things. He's releasing books. He's being a bit more serious about his beliefs now than just editing a newspaper. And again, in December 1847, which is quite a productive year for him, he participates in the first Congress of the Communist League in London and is tasked together with Engels to write a manifesto on behalf of the group, among other people who were also drafting similar manifestos. And the idea was that they would kind of mesh them together and come to some kind of conclusive communist ideology.
So was the Communist League something that was popular at that point, or
not
would it become
particularly?
popular
It was just
only later?
It was a group of intellectuals that were largely under 30.
So it wasn't a political party, or
not really. It was more. It has more akin to a secret society than anything else, and it was mainly an intellectual thing, and there were no actual working men there. Although they did try and get a figurehead of a working man, just so
a token working man.
Yeah, because they claimed to represent them, but none of them were actually like manual labourers. They were all academics. So I think they were well aware that this looked really bad, so no one's going to take them seriously. They have no experience, so they had this token working man leading them, but really it was just Marx and Engels running things behind the scenes.
What is this working?
Yeah, they're not really big fans of that. So this is a particularly egregious form of manipulation here. One of the members of the Congress of the Communist League, submitted a draft of their manifesto to Engels, who secretly substituted it with the Marxian manifesto in its place and didn't tell them. And he told Marx of his betrayal to this person, and he made him swear secrecy that that he never disclose what he has done.
Oh, he did.
So yeah, well, we only know because of the letters. It's not like Marx ratted him out because it was promoting his own ideas. And as I said earlier, Marx is well aware of the manipulative things he has to do to make his ideology more successful, because
It's not like he's doing it inadvertently. It's not
exactly.
like he's...
Yeah. He's being deliberately manipulative, and you'll see this later on as well, where he infiltrates organisations and he will deliberately delay their proceedings until he sees an opportunity to seize power, and then he will either alter documents behind the scenes, like there's a case of a workers' party in London where he delays them for a couple of months, and then they submit something for him just to read, like proofread and then send off again, but he actually changes all the content. They came up with 40 rules, which he condensed to 10, and it seems like he was taking things upon himself to misrepresent even his political allies. So he was certainly no good friend to have, politically speaking, anyway. So, as a result of their kind of backstabbing, in February 1848, the publication of the Communist Manifesto is distributed in German, and this is largely the work of Marx and Engels, although they actually list no authors to make it seem like a more legitimate work of a large organisation rather than a handful of people, which is quite clever, but then it's not like they've been averse to manipulating things before. So later on in 1848, there is, of course, the Spring of Revolution, where the French monarchy is overthrown again. A number of major German and Italian states and Austria pressure the leadership to grant a form of liberal constitution, and the German and Italian states seem to be trending towards forming a nation state. Also...
Yes, sorry. So, as far as I know, he didn't take part too much in this kind of wave of revolutions.
He was kind of cheering on at the sidelines, as far as I'm aware.
Sure, but those revolutions weren't kind of in the spirit of what he would have wanted, right? Those were more liberally aligned rather than socialistically aligned. I mean, broadly, like that's an oversimplification, of course, but something like that, right?
I don't think he was ungrateful for the progress that they made. He was far happier to have liberalism than monarchy, as far as I'm aware. And to carry on, Austria also gave the Hungarians and the Czechs grants of autonomy and national status. However, by the summer of 1949, many of the reactionaries returned to power and drove many of the revolutionaries into exile. So, although there were some successes, many of them were driven away permanently. So in June 1848, Marx became the editor-in-chief of the...
Neue Rheinische Zeitung.
Thank you.
So that's a rehash of his previous
I'm
newspaper.
assuming that must just mean new.
Yeah, it is new.
And this is in Paris, and Marx writes approximately 80 articles until the 19th of May, 1849. So that's quite a few articles over the course of... I don't know.
11 months.
Something like that, yeah. However, he's still not earning enough to support himself. His mother also forwards him enough money in advance from his inheritance to live for several years. However, he spends it all in 1 year buying arms for a failed uprising. So, again, we see how his inability to spend money prudently is shooting himself in the foot. And from this point onwards, he's reliant mainly on income from Engels, who was working in his father's factory, which he actually referred to as forced labour, which is a very flippant use of the word considering what their ideology went on to create. And he said it was forced labour because he had to be in the office by 10 a.m. That was his work ethic. Oh my. I'm forced to get up for 10 a.m. How awful. Like, it's unreal. In the Victorian era as well, they must have seen the poverty around them, and they're like, oh, it's terrible that I have to be up by such an early time in the morning. Like, it's genuinely annoying me.
And also, like, they would have been aware of how the working class lived around them, right? Because like that's what they were interested in, and they did some research, or not them directly, but the associates did some research into how the working classes actually lived and what they went through, right?
I know Engels actually wrote a book about the working class in England as well. So in Engels' factory that he worked in, his father employed 800 people, and Engels was placed in a middle management position, but did eventually work his way through the ranks enough to earn enough to retire at 50, and that was alongside also supporting Marx and his family. So he must have done pretty well for himself, thanks to his father's generosity in giving him a job that I imagine he probably wouldn't have got otherwise.
You can get more parallels with Hunter Biden. Interesting. Mm.
I mean, I'm not a big proponent of history repeating itself, but I mean, in this case,
As we say at this brand, gets the noggin jogging.
and in June 1849, Marx moves into London, or a London slum, should I say? So the poor part of London where he'd remain for the rest of his life, and this is again largely due to his fiscal mismanagement rather than any misfortune that has fallen upon him.
Yeah. So even then he had quite a stable income, right? So he wasn't like the income was the source of the problems.
I actually have a good frame of reference here.
Mm-hmm.
So in the slums, he often did struggle to pay for rent and food. However, hang on, I'll just find the notes. I'm skipping ahead a little bit just to tie it in.
Yeah.
Here we go. So Marx kind of had the income of a lower middle class person, so he was hardly doing poorly. He was earning 3 times that of an unskilled worker in England, so it wasn't as if he wasn't earning enough to support himself. I mean, 3 times that of an unskilled worker is certainly not bad, because he's mostly relying on someone's charity as well.
Yep.
So he can't really complain, and I don't necessarily feel very sympathetic to his hardships, because he was doing pretty well for himself and he's not taking any responsibility for this hardship. And even less sympathetic towards him in the fact that in his time living in the slums, 3 of his children died, one of which he did not even have enough money to pay for a burial. However, to kind of give him a bit of credit, he did seem to really care about his children, and he spent a lot of time with them, telling them stories, caring about their development, and it seems like he was trying to emulate his father in spending lots of time and focusing on their education. So credit where credit's due. Although he was terrible with money and he could have helped them out in that way, he at least dedicated his time to them. And I've got a quote here that seems to suggest that much of the psychological impact of his children's death had a very severe kind of hardening effect on him, in that he says, "My child's death has shattered my heart and my brain." So he seems to be genuinely upset, and in letters to Engels as well, he does express how he almost can't get over the fact that his children weren't doing very well.
So like that's kind of another thing that we can say about his supporters or followers now that resembles him as well. They often genuinely care about other people, but in what they do, they don't help help them at all. So
like in theory they care about them, but in practice they do things that don't help them.
Like if you take what they say and how they kind of look, then you would say that they care about them. But if you look at how they act, it doesn't seem to follow that, even though you might believe them if they say that.
He also refused to accept any responsibility for his children's death, blaming bourgeois misery, which sounds very vague, also a bit hypocritical considering his middle class background. So I don't really understand how. I know he.
What's bourgeois misery? I mean, is it misery under the rule of the bourgeoisie?
I'd presume that's what he means. Yeah.
Right. So it's not like, okay, this is the bourgeoisie and that the bourgeoisie lives in misery.
No,
Because that doesn't make that much sense. I mean,
no, he kind of saw the bourgeois as the enemy, living in luxury at the expense of the working man, even though.
And so he saw himself as part of the working class, right?
Yeah.
Even though he wasn't really.
He had an upper middle class background, and for even when he was in so-called poverty, he still had a lower middle class kind of
income.
That's the one. I don't know how I forgot that. So most historians seem to think that Marx's poor money management is to blame, for much of the poverty that he suffered because comparatively to the people he lived around, he had a large income. It was just his frivolous spending, as I've gone over before. And his lifestyle also didn't help him out personally as well. So he was plagued with poor health problems, which were certainly made worse by the fact he had poor sleeping habits, in that he would stay up all night and sleep through the day and get up when he felt like it. He drank a lot of alcohol, he didn't really exercise, and he didn't really wash, which, I mean, it's a cheap shot, but he also shares that in common with some of his supporters. It's like the old joke, how can you tell it's a Marxist protest? You know, you just smell it.
I'm not going to comment on that.
That is cheap and it should be beneath me, but I couldn't
You should
resist.
be ashamed, Josh.
So, also pretty horrendously, at this time they had a servant who was sent by Jenny, his wife's mother, and they were not actually able to pay her. Nevertheless, she actually worked for them for free out of a sense of loyalty, and even passed up paid work, like legitimate paid work for other people, to remain loyal to the Marx family.
That's kind of weird though. Like she, the maid and Engels, like those are the two people that like kept by them throughout their life, throughout Marx's life, even though he acted like not great,
Yeah.
and even towards them, right? And so that doesn't really make sense. It seems like there's some people that did kind of all this without, or just,
And
I don't really understand that.
get the mug out, because it does get worse. And his maid became pregnant, which Engels took the blame for. However, it did later emerge that after Marx's death, it was actually Marx's own child. So under his wife's nose, he impregnated his maid, who was working for free for him in the first place. And Engels confessed to Marx's daughter on his deathbed that it wasn't actually his, and he just took the blame. And she was supposedly distraught about this, because obviously it's kind of very bad for her perception of her father, understandably. And even so, the boy was sent to be raised with a working class family, and he was only allowed to visit his mother through the back door in secrecy from, I imagine, Marx's wife. So in April 1855, another one of Marx's children dies, his son Edgar, at the age of 8 from gastric fever. And following this, many years later, on November 1863, Marx's mother, Henriette, dies in Trier, and Marx supposedly did not necessarily care about this. In a letter to Engels, he seemed to show little sympathy for her and focused entirely on getting his inheritance as quickly as possible, which is a pretty awful thing. And it seems to me that he still held a grudge
For her stopping, that she stopped supporting him at that point.
He stopped
after
getting
university.
his allowance, and therefore he held that against her for the rest of her life. And he didn't go to her funeral. He didn't seem really to care.
It doesn't sound very reasonable.
No, and he seems to have a very flippant attitude to other people, in that there's a letter from a few years earlier where he says there, in a letter to Engels, he says there's some good news that his wife's uncle is ill, and he stated that if that dog dies, I'll be out of trouble financially. So that's a pretty horrendous outlook for someone who's so apparently concerned about human suffering. I mean, why is he talking in these terms? Like he doesn't even...
Well, he's concerned about the suffering of the proletariat. His wife's uncle is not the proletariat.
That's true.
It all makes sense.
If I'm being charitable, which I don't think he deserves, but I'm going to say it anyway, it could be that he's being a little bit dark in his humour to Engels, because it seemed like they had kind of a shared sense of humour in that respect, in that he says lots of things that are very negative about other people that he doesn't really espouse elsewhere. Unless that's how he really felt, it's not clear, or whether he just had a dark sense of humour. Like,
so isn't it hard to say whether what he was saying publicly was what he actually thought, or what he was saying privately, or if it was the other way around and he was just joking in his private conversations?
I wouldn't be surprised though if he really did feel this way, because in his dealings with his mother, I mean, he clearly didn't really care, and his letters about it seem to reflect that, and the fact that he didn't really lament it at all. He was just kind of he was very apathetic towards it. So anyway, moving on to something a bit less depressing. In September 1867, Das Kapital is published, which aimed to reveal economic patterns underpinning the capitalist mode of production and contrast that to the interpretations of classical political economists such as Adam Smith and many of the others. And later in 1868, Engels pays off Marx's significant debts, which is just a running theme, really. Engels bailing out Marx, I don't know why. Engels was also later furious when he found out that there were a couple more copies of Das Kapital. It came out in a few volumes, and Marx had just withheld from publishing them because he didn't want to pay for it himself. So he just kind of held them.
So Engels was supporting him on the condition, or on the presumption that Marx had been writing the Capital.
Well, they'd worked together, and they had the finished manuscripts, but he just kind of had them on the side, and he didn't want to pay a publisher to publish them. So he just kind of left it and worked on his own things. Like, there was the first copy got published, and it only sold about 1,000 copies. Right. So it wasn't enough of an income for them to last on for very long.
I thought he'd put that aside to work on something else.
He did. That's why do that, but he hasn't. It was still finished.
It was finished.
I believe so, at least from what I've read. That these volumes were finished. They simply just weren't published.
Yeah, and I think Engels didn't know about that, right? He was working in Manchester, and Marx was in London.
So they weren't actually working together in person. It was they were posting things to one another, and I think I would imagine that if they were working together on this book, Marx must have had to have misled him about not publishing these books, because it would seem very strange to me that much later on, when Marx had died, Engels would be angry that these books wouldn't be published, because he'd actually worked on them himself, and yet Marx didn't actually get around to publishing them like he thought he had. So it seems to me that there's something funny going on, but not many people have really looked at that, and I suppose it's only a minute detail.
Yeah.
So in December 1881, Marx's wife, Jenny, dies, and he was very upset about this. Much like his children, he was very attached to his wife and clearly cared about her a great deal, and it seems like he kind of lost a bit of the drive to carry on, and this is further exacerbated by the fact that in January 1883, Marx's eldest daughter dies aged 38 near Paris, likely of bladder cancer, and it seems like this is the final straw for Marx, because in the 14th of March 1883, Karl Marx dies at the age of 64, so only a few months after his daughter. So I think towards the end he gave up, and at the very end only 12 people actually turned up to his funeral after all of the connections he made. So it seems like he died in relative obscurity. No one really read his work at the time, and it was only much later on that he became popular, and he kind of died poor and disgraced. But given his kind of future legacy, I'm not going to feel too bad about the condition in which he found himself towards the end. Obviously, I don't want his family to die there innocent, but Marx didn't really deserve the privileged life that he had, considering his horrific beliefs and the way he acted in life, I don't think. And people, I think, are far too unaware of the fact that he was a terrible person. I think it's safe to say. Like,
yeah, I mean the way that even his friends describe him and talk about him as the devil, and this bad personality, bad influence, and someone that you don't want to.
Yeah, and he was
anger.
so intolerant of other people's beliefs that he would manipulate things behind the scenes to get his ideas actualized, and he would pretty much do whatever was in his own self-interest, which, for someone who was very critical of capitalism making people selfish, you would think that he'd be a bit more self-aware in his own actions. But I think there's no greater demonstration of selfishness than the life of Karl Marx.
Okay, I mean, I think that was a pretty good summary of what he was like. I mean, that was it's not really something that people focus on too much, because usually it's about his ideology, which is the more important thing. But it's also interesting to see how he lived and what he did and how he was, to figure out how that might play into what he actually thought.
Well, yeah, your values affect how you live your life, don't they? So if someone has a kind of tough life, although obviously there are circumstances where people are just unfortunate, but if in this case where he's very much brought his own suffering upon himself, it's very difficult to be sympathetic, and especially the legacy that his ideas have brought about, and the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people who have been killed because of his beliefs. I feel very indifferent to the life that he had, I suppose.
Well, I think that's the good way to end it today.
And on that very dark note, thank you very much for watching.
Well, and if you like this episode, well, feel free to subscribe to our channel and go to lotusseaters.com, where we have all of our other stuff. In addition to all the other episodes of the Contemplations, we've got premium articles, we've got news articles, we've got analyses, we've got everything that you might imagine, and we've got all that, a lot out of that for free. But also we've got premium stuff, and that premium stuff is for the low price of $5 per month. $5 per month or £5 a month. And so if you'd like to support us, become a premium member at lotusseaters.com, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for watching.